Hello friends, this is Growl, and welcome to my Season 4 Resto Druid guide for Mythic Plus. I wasn't sure I was going to have to make a new one of these, but there's actually a ton to talk about now that we have items and dungeon encounters available from the entire expansion. I'm going to break down the most important choices for setting up your character, as well as go into some detail on what your average rotation and gameplay is like. If there is a need for a more advanced guide, let me know what stuff you'd like to see in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to subscribe for all the new healer content as it gets released for the upcoming expansion, The War Within. Now let's talk about Druid. You have a limited amount of races available to you, and your best option is going to be Night Elf. Not only does the racial Shadow Meld allow you to dodge dangerous targeted mechanics, but it also allows you to drop out of combat at times. This can be immensely helpful for being able to get a drink in if you're low on mana, or you can even resurrect an ally without wasting a valuable combat res. That being said, every race choice is going to have its benefits. If you don't feel like changing, I wouldn't worry about it. It's not going to have a major impact on your overall gameplay. When it comes to stat priority, the most important thing you look for is just item level. All stats are somewhat good for druids. Equipping the highest item level piece is often going to be the best choice since it gives you the most intellect. When choosing between two pieces of equal item level, your most valuable stat is haste. You want to prioritize haste at least until you reach the second level of diminishing returns, or around 40% unbuffed. If you're unsure how these breakpoints work, I'd highly recommend the add-on True Stat Values. It isn't a hard breakpoint, but it would be roughly what I'm aiming for. Beyond haste, you have to make a choice depending on what you value. Your second best healing stat for 5-mans is going to be Mastery. Mastery especially increases healing to targets with Life Bloom on them, and you'll be playing double Life Bloom in all dungeons. The downside is that Mastery doesn't affect your damage, so you'll have wasted stats during that downtime when that healing isn't needed. If you are concerned about your damage, you'll want to focus on crit and verse roughly equally instead and forego Mastery. These stats are alright for healing, but contribute a large amount to your damage. In general, I would build two sets of gear, one with haste mastery and another with haste and then crit verse. If anything, maybe just a different neck and different rings so that you can switch quickly, and between whatever dungeon group you're in or what you feel like is needed for the situation. The embellishment system added in Dragonflight has turned out to be not super interesting. None of your embellishments that you craft are going to have a dramatic impact on your gameplay. The order you craft them in also doesn't really matter a whole lot. You just want to choose slots where you haven't been able to grab an upgrade yet from dungeons or raids. The main two embellishments I think people will be using are Verdant Tether on either bracers or ring, and a Lariat Neck. Don't forget to also craft a piece with the Well-Fed embellishment that increases the duration of your food buff and allows it to persist through death. Similar to your choice of racial, your embellishments won't make or break your character. If there's certain pieces you prefer or that you just already have, don't worry about them too much. What will have a big impact is your trinket choice. This season's reintroduced the ability to purchase specific trinkets from any raid in the expansion. There are some really good trinkets, and you'll be able to buy one every 2 weeks on top of whatever you get on your own. The single best DPS trinket right now is Tome of Unstable Power, actually from Azure Vault, not even from the raid. This thing does okay damage on single target, but goes absolutely insane on AoE. Azure Vault has a couple other nice haste items, as well as a pretty lenient timer. It's a pretty good dungeon to spam while you're gearing up. Your trinket buy from the raid should be one of two major shield trinkets, either Ward of the Faceless Ire or Fyrax Rage Heart. Both trinkets are a large on-use absorb. The ward is a smaller absorb, but it can be used on anyone in your party and also gives you int, so it'll be stronger for healing. Fyrax is a much larger shield and gives you versatility, but can only be used on yourself. I think I would probably buy ward first, but I'm definitely considering coming back and buying Fyrax later, since the increased tankiness could be really good in some dungeons. After you have a shield trinket and your tome, you probably want to get a nice stat stick trinket. I believe the best one is Omnichromatic Essence from Aberrus, but if you get an incarnate icon from the first raid, that works too. Once you have all three trinkets, you can pick and choose depending on the situation. You'll use Tome and whatever shield trinket as like a general use. If you want more healing, you can swap out the Tome for a stat stick. Or if you want more damage, then you can run Tome with the stat stick. Lastly, I also want to mention the Naimu staff. This is going to be your best weapon and can also be purchased from the vendor. It's got very high haste and also an on use, which gives you some free damage. In terms of order, you can pick and choose depending on what you're able to loot, similar to your embellishments. For example, if you manage to farm up 2 really good trinkets, but you don't have a good weapon, you can just decide to grab the Naimu staff with your first purchase, since weapons have so many stats. In general though, good trinkets are a lot harder to come by, so you'll probably end up picking a ward first. As a last minute note, I think the Tome Trinket might be so out of line that it has a chance of getting nerfed. If that's the case and you're watching this video after a nerf, I'd probably just end up using Chromatic Essence and a Shield Trinket in every dungeon. If you do want to experiment with other DPS trinkets, feel free to do so, but honestly, so many of the dungeons require that immense amount of healing, even at kind of lower levels. I don't think any pure DPS trinket is really worth it for Druid. Now that you have a handle on your item setup, we can talk about talents. Your talent build is roughly the same as it was last season and should look a little something like this. To talk about the spec tree first, the resto tree, since it's more simple, there's not much variation with what you're going to take. The only real choice I think is tree form versus convoke. Convoke is better for burst healing and also does damage. Tree form is better for like more drawn out healing needs. I'd say it's mostly a preference thing. Wouldn't worry too much about what choice is right. There also are some niche choices that you might see other druids taking in high keys, stuff like increased duration on Ironbark. In general, this is going to be really dungeon specific and aimed at dealing with like very difficult encounters in specific situations. It's too much to include in this video, both because that's for people who are druid experts and also because we haven't gotten much time to test keys that high yet. As for the class tree, it's a complicated mess that leaves most druids bummed out. There's so many powerful nodes that take such a huge commitment and points to get, you're never going to get everything that you want. All of the different utility and bonuses are situational. There's not really a right answer. You should really custom fit your class tree depending on your group comp, what dungeon you're in, the affixes, and so on. As some general rules, I like bringing Skull Bash in either pugs or just like on fortified weeks, and on tyrannical weeks or more organized groups, I'm more likely to take the defensive talents instead. Typhoon, Nature's Cure, and Ursul's Vortex are sort of dungeon and situation dependent with whatever your group needs. I would put Heart of the Wild and Wild Charge as sort of nice to have, but they may have to go if you need things to sacrifice. The most important thing that you need to ask yourself is, am I making good use of this talent? Since if you're not using it much, there's always going to be something that's really good that you're missing out on. Once your setup is under control, it's time to worry about rotation. Healing wise, current Resto Druid is what I would describe as like a maintenance class. You have a checklist of abilities that should be rolling, and then some basic direct heals and cooldowns. If there's healing that needs to be done, either right now or coming up, you need to make sure the following 4 things are true. Life Bloom is active on 2 party members, Flow is on the ground where people are standing, Cenarian Ward and Adaptive Swarm are being used on cooldown, and if you have 3 charges of Grove Guardians, spend 1. This is not only going to make up a huge chunk of your healing, but it's also going to provide a setup that boosts any future healing that you need to do. If you feel like your heals are weak or you're failing to keep up with damage, chances are you're lacking in at least one of these 4 areas. I've included in the description an incredibly useful weak aura, one that pins any of the spell icons to your cursor if you're failing one of these 4 rules. It might feel a little bit clunky at first, but it should immediately have a massive impact on your throughput if you're constantly firing all 4 of these rules off and keeping it true. Your direct healing from there is simple. You just regrowth for single target healing, wild growth for AoE. You can and should use Swiftmend regularly to empower these abilities with Soul of the Forest. It doesn't really matter what you empower as long as it's fitting the situation that you need. You could also use your extra Grove Guardians charges whenever you fall behind, or you know there's going to be burst damage coming up. In general, it's good to lean on the side of overusing your charges. Don't forget that they're there. A couple small things rotationally to add. Grove Guardians is not on the global cooldown, and you can use it in any form, so don't waste a cast when you use them. Just sort of weave it in within all of your other abilities. Also remember that regrowth is always applied to anyone who has Life Bloom. So let's say you're spreading out HOTS, you want to prefer a target without Life Bloom with your regrowth. Lastly, Rejuve without any talents or passives buffing it just isn't really that efficient of a button, and you shouldn't really be pressing it much unless you're using it as fodder for your Swiftmend, or you already have all of your other key heals out and you're just ramping for upcoming damage. As for cooldowns, you have Flourish and then either Convoke or Tree of Life. Before flourishing, you want to make sure you send out a Wild Growth, preferably empowered with Swift Mend, and then have your 2 life blooms active. Flourish is a short 1-minute CD, so it should be used often. Convoke is similar, however, you prefer to like pre-plan for the damage and then flourish all of your hots, rather than just sort of shoot off a Convoke, although you can be using it in a pinch. The main benefit of Convoke is that you can also just use it for damage. Tree form when you don't need the damage and instead like sustained healing over a longer period. Dungeons like Ruby Life Pools or Halls of Infusion with really high healing demand bosses are good times to run Tree of Life. You don't really change your rotation much in Tree, you simply just press it and your heals will do a little bit more. Also, your regrowths are instant cast, allowing you to heal more seamlessly while you're moving. Remember that your Tree CD is shortened for each Grove Guardian use, another reason why you don't want to overcap on those charges. When it comes to your DPS, a majority of your damage as Druid will come from your dots. On single target, maintain Sunfire and Moonfire, then get into cat form and maintain Rake and Rip. Use Shred to build your points, and then Bite to spend them if your target already has a Rip or is going to die within the next 20 seconds or so. On AoE, your rotation is more or less the same. You do want to make sure you're focusing on priority targets, but when there are more than 3 mobs, you want to maintain Thrash as well, and then also use Swipe instead of Shred as a filler. Don't over-focus on spamming abilities like fillers, swipe, or wrath or whatever for damage. It might feel like you're doing a lot, but remember that swipe is soft-capped at 5 targets, and wrath hits for like nothing. A majority of your damage just simply comes from your gear level and your trinkets, as well as maintaining all of your dots. Remember, Druid is a maintenance class for damage as well as healing. Well, that covers the basics of your setup and gameplay as Resto Druid in Season 4 of Dragonflight. I expect to be playing a lot of this class over the season, so let me know what sorts of Resto Druid content you'd like to see, or questions that you have that didn't get answered in the video. I also plan on doing somewhat of a UI rework. I'll have my current UI in the description, but look forward to a more cleaned up version coming soon for the end of the expansion and then going into the War Within. Thanks again for watching, friends, and happy keying.